then we can start.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dawie Boonzaaier. I'm the political editor for Rapport. It's a large Afrikaans Sunday, national Afrikaans Sunday newspaper in South Africa. First of all, I want to say thank you to the Zuid-Afrikahuis for inviting me here. It's been a wonderful stay, especially as somebody whose forefathers are of Dutch descent. It's been fun traveling around here and tracing their roots and also seeing other parts of Europe. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed the stay immensely. Um, I want to talk to you about the South African elections today, which happened on the 29th of May this year, and the subsequent coalition government that was formed on national level, South Africa's first national coalition government since the first democratic elections of 1994. You can do the next slide, Vessel. But first, I want to talk to you about something that might be a bit more familiar to our Dutch listeners. Um, on the 22nd of November 2023, the Netherlands held a snap election after the fourth cabinet of Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte collapsed due to policy disagreements on immigration. No single party received the majority of votes, and so discussions to form a government had to start in earnest, with an agreement finally being reached on the 6th of May this year. A full 176 days later. This time elapse is, of course, not even the longest political parties in the Netherlands had taken to form a government. In 2017, after that election, it took 225 days for the parties to form a government, the longest government formation period in the Netherlands. Now, let me take you to my home country. You can do the next slide, Vessel. Who, on the 29th of May this year, held their seventh democratic elections. And for the first time in a democratic South Africa, it looked like the African National Congress, or the ANC, might not win a majority. After years of misrule, neglecting service delivery, corruption rendering state owned organizations bankrupt, crime running rampant due to underfunded and corrupt police force, and state owned hospitals being in a state of disaster due to mismanagement, various political polls predicted that the ANC would dip below 50% of the support they needed from voters to form a government on their own. But these polls didn't just predict a slight dip below 50%, which would have been wouldn't have been a disaster for the ANC, as they could easily get one of their breakaway parties or a left-leaning party to then form a government, but rather a massive drop of 17 percentage points to a 40% vote share. You can go to the next slide, Vessel. And this is the ANC support during all the years. As you can see, comfortable majorities in every election since 1994 up until 2019. And then you can go to the next slide, Vessel. And so this is exactly what happened this year. The ANC received only 40.2% of votes. The Centre-Right Liberal Democratic Alliance, or the DA, received 21.8%. The populist MK Party, headed by former South African President and ANC leader Jacob Zuma, received 14.6% of the votes. The Communist and Black Nationalist Economic Freedom Fighters received 9.5%. And the Conservative Zulu Party, the IFP, received 3.9% of the votes. With the results being ratified by the Electoral Commission on the 2nd of June, this kick-started a process whereby parties had to form a government within 14 days, because the South African Constitution prescribes that Parliament must elect a new Speaker, a Deputy Speaker, and President within 14 days since the election results were ratified. This, in effect, means that South Africa's political parties essentially had 8% of the time to form a government, the 8% of the time that their Dutch counterparts had to form a government. So, how do you form a government within 14 days? And between parties whose ideological differences range from capitalism to socialism and conservatives to die-hard liberals. It turns out with numerous late night meetings, lots of threats, and a bit of sheer luck. You can go to the next slide, Vessel. You can also go to the next. The two biggest parties in the country, the ANC and the DA, reached out to each other first. Though they're not active fits to be political partners, the DA's leader, John Steenhuisen, it's him in the picture they're celebrating, um, numerous times in the run up to the election conceded that it wasn't possible to remove the ANC from government altogether. His next task would be to prevent a coalition between the ANC and the MK and or the EFF. According to Steenhuisen, he describes this potential coalition as a doomsday scenario for South Africans' fortunes due to both parties' economic policies that centered around the nationalization of property and the Reserve Bank, as well as elements of corruption within both parties. Zuma, South Africa's president between 2009 and 2018, or as our current president Cyril Ramaphosa will describe it, the nine wasted years, was famously seen as the state president that facilitated state capture in South Africa by the infamous Gupta family, who significantly influenced the state's decision making processes to their own advantages. The first formal meeting between the ANC and the DA's negotiators took place on the 3rd of June, a day after the election results were ratified. And whilst the DA were keen to get cracking on discussing the formation of government, the ANC's negotiators first had to consult the party's National Executive Committee. During a marathon two-day meeting of the National Executive Committee, the ANC's negotiators were unable to sell the idea of a grand coalition with the DA to form a government. This was due to left-leaning party members, which include alliance partners such as the South African Communist Party and the trade union COSATU, which feared that the DA's policies differed too much from the ANC's. I think they accused the DA of being neoliberalists and counter-revolutionaries. It's only in South Africa where you get a government that's been in government for almost close to 30 years, but they still speak about the revolution. During a so so the ANC compromised eventually because they couldn't form this grand coalition with the DA. Because they were too afraid to form the coalition, they announced on the 6th of June that they would seek to form a government of national unity, or a GNU, and invited every single party representation in the South African parliament to form part of this GNU. Luckily for the DA, both MK and the EFF declined this invitation the next day on the 7th of June. MK would only participate in the government of national unity if the ANC resolved to remove President Cyril Ramaphosa as their leader, while the EFF refused to participate if the DA and the Freedom Front Plus formed part of the government, mainly due to the fact that the DA and the Freedom Front Plus have white leaders. This left the ANC and the DA with 1 week to agree a deal before the election of the president, the speaker, and the deputy speaker, only 7 days. That is obviously not enough time to agree a full-blown coalition agreement, with the parties then agreeing to rather just draft a statement of intent to form a government, which would provide a broad framework on how to form a government and establish some key non-negotiables. By the 13th of June, one day left, the two parties broadly concluded a statement of intent which they would sign as an agreement to form a government. President Ramaphosa would then finalize the agreement during the evening ahead of the next day's voting in of himself and the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker. But on the morning of the 14th, the DA's Helen Zille, the chairperson of the Federal Council, received the statement of intent back, but to her shock saw that two key clauses had been removed by the ANC overnight. The clauses dealt specifically with parties' proportional representation in cabinet and sufficient consensus that had to be reached between parties for government policy. Both these clauses had been diluted so much as to render them ineffectual, with the ANC saying that parties with 50% of representation in parliament was needed to reach sufficient consensus on government policy, while the DA wanted it to be 60%, so that the ANC couldn't establish any government policy without the DA support. The ANC also removed the words proportional representation altogether when referring to the establishment of a cabinet, which would effectively mean that Ramaphosa could appoint a cabinet with 90% ANC members. Zille refused to sign the statement of intent unless these clauses were put back into the document, which in effect meant that the ANC and the DA had to start negotiations again at 8 o'clock in the morning, just a few hours before the elections, or the election of the speaker and the deputy speaker had to start. And the DA had made it clear that they wouldn't support any candidates of the ANC unless the statement of intent was signed, which left the ANC vulnerable to be toppled if the DA did not support them. By 11:20 that morning, with members of parliament already being sworn in and the voting for the critical role of speaker due to start imminently, no deal had been reached. And at 11:35, the document was finally finalized, with the two clauses put back in, but still needed to be signed by both parties before the voting started. And unfortunately, all of the party leaders were then already in parliament busy with their swearing in, so they couldn't sign it. But luckily, the EFF's then deputy leader was adamant that a caucus break must take place for voting to get started, before the voting started. And although the presiding officer was reluctant to grant one, he eventually conceded, which meant that Shivambu earnestly called for the caucus break that allowed the ANC and the DA to conclude their government, and that Shivambu's party was vehemently opposed to. He was the actual hero in the whole end. Toko Dudiza was of the ANC was elected as speaker. Annelie Lottrid of the DA was elected as deputy speaker, and Cyril Ramaphosa was re-elected as president of the country. You can go to the next slide. But what has happened since? Obviously, it's not a good idea to get married after 14 days of just knowing each other. So the fallouts have been numerous and plentiful, as you can see in these headlines. And the ANC basically just ignoring the statement of intent that they helped set up. Some of the stuff that they've ignored is they've invited 7 other parties to sign the statement of intent, even though the document plainly states that other parties could only join if the original signatories, the ANC and the DA, agree to it. This has luckily not irked the DA too much because MK and the EFF have still not made a U turn on their decision to join government. The DA has had to make a range of concessions, though. Even though the statement of intent states that parties' representation in government should be based on proportional representation, the DA only received six positions in the cabinet consisting of 32 members. This means that the DA, which holds 30.2% of the seat in government, only received 18.8% of cabinet positions. The ANC, meanwhile, who holds 55.2% of the seats in government, has a proportional representation in cabinet of 62.5%. There are other examples as well. When the new Minister of Sport, Arts and Culture, the Patriotic Alliance leader Gayton McKenzie, attended the Olympics opening ceremony, his deputy minister, the ANC's Peace Mabe, put out a statement without his consent condemning Israel's participation in the Olympics, even though she knew this was a position that McKenzie would not support. In the statement of intent, parties also agreed to hold a national dialogue where the policy of the new government would be established. But the DA fears that the ANC wants to hijack this dialogue because they haven't asked any of the other parties to provide input on who should attend the dialogue. President Ramaphosa also signed a very contentious law, the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, which will now take away schools' governing bodies' rights to decide on stuff like language policies and admission policies, despite known opposition from the DA and the Freedom from Plus to this act. Only at the last minute did he announce that the two most controversial clauses would be withheld for more consultation. So, in effect, the ANC is currently still governing like a party which holds the majority of seats in government. Every time the DA has cried foul, the ANC has said that the DA are welcome to leave the GNU. This despite the fact that it's probably the DA's presence in the GNU which has made it such a roaring success with local markets, including a 5.8% boost to the Rand and numerous bond surges. And even though his party might seem quite blasé about the DA leaving the GNU, Ramaphosa has himself given his backing that the GNU in its current form should last the full 5-year term of government. Addressing the United Nations General Assembly for the first time since the formation of the GNU, Ramaphosa last month said that South Africa is in a new era, an era of great promise. You can go to the next slide, Vessel. Some other stuff to mull over when thinking about why would people stay in an abusive relationship is the new polls that were released by the Social Research Foundation last week. According to the poll, which included 1,200 registered voters and has a 3% margin of error, most parties in the GNU support has gone up since the establishment of the GNU some 100 days ago. The ANC is now supported by 45% of voters, the DA by 24%, and the IFP by 5%. On the other side, the two main parties who decided to remain outside the GNU, MK and the EFF, have seen their support decline. MK is down to 12%, while the EFF is down to a paltry 6%. When respondents were asked if the GNU is working well, 57.9% indicated that the GNU is working well, whilst 58.7% indicated that they believe the GNU will be a success. This data illustrates the enormous amount of pressure on the parties in the GNU to make it a success. If they fail, they will all be punished at the ballot box. South Africans have now shown that sentimental value to a party on which the ANC long relied doesn't count anymore. They want results. So, what then is the way forward when there's enormous pressure to make this thing work? But it kind of seems that the one partner doesn't want to be there, and the other partner doesn't want to act like he's got any partners in the relationship. You can go to the next slide, Vessel. So the ANC's coalition partners surely cannot accept the ANC's agenda every single time moving forward. South Africans voted for a coalition government, not more of the ANC. This is further illustrated by the Social Research Foundation poll, which indicated that 67.4% of respondents want the government to do away with race-based appointments in the civil service. This is ANC policy, but it's not supported by either the DA, the IFP, the Freedom from Plus, or the PA. At some point, the ANC's coalition partners will need to stand up for their voters on matters such as these. One short-term solution, I think, would be the so-called national dialogue. But then it would have to include a whole range of views, not just the regular ANC cheerleaders. For this to happen, the ANC would need to invite their coalition partners to provide inputs on how the dialogue should move forward. Only then can a real and frank discussion be held on the way that this dialogue will inform the new government's policies. Another short term solution was luckily also recently put in place with the establishment of a committee that would act as a dispute resolution mechanism. Every party Every party will have equal representation on this committee to debate any potential upcoming issues regarding policy. But what about a long term resolution? And this is where I think we can learn a lot from our Dutch counterparts. Coalitions are very new to South Africa, but evidently it is not new here or in other parts of Europe. Therefore, it might be time for South Africa to reconsider the part of their constitution which forces party to appoint a president within 14 days of the election. Every negotiator from every single party I've spoken to regarding coalitions have lamented the short time they have allocated to strike a deal. I'm of the opinion that the growing pains we're seeing in SHGNU could have been avoided if proper negotiations had taken place over a much longer period of time. Because currently our government seems more like a marriage of convenience than a genuine coming together of parties and government in the same direction. I'd much rather they all talk it out over 176 days rather than the 14 days with threats of leaving it every single week. Thank you very much. Um, I don't know if you usually do this, but I mean, if everybody's got questions, you're more than welcome to ask. You also don't have to ask here. You can speak to me afterwards as well. I'm friendly, I promise.